Okay. Good morning and welcome to the Regional Parks Botanic Gardens Wayne Roderick Lecture Series. This is one of only two that are going to be via Zoom this season. And our guest speaker today is my good friend and co-author, Carol Bornstein. Carol is now retired. Uh,
Semi.
Yes, and as I refer to her, uh, to bug her as now a lady of leisure. But she keeps very busy. She is the formerly in charge of the LA Museum of Natural History's Nature Garden. She was the person that really got that project off the ground and running
Mm.
as the first person in charge of it. And then prior to that, for many years, she was director of horticulture and other positions at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. Carol and I go way back to sometime in the early 1990s. Um, and again, we're co-authors of the book California Native Plants for the Garden and of Reimagining the California Lawn. Today, Carol's going to speak on a topic she's never spoken on. Uh,
That's
and this and this is all of her, or many of her, plant introductions over the years. Many of them were done through Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, but even after she left Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, she's been selecting plants from gardens and from the wild and introducing them through a number of different venues, probably most notably San Marcos Growers and Randy Baldwin. But I'm sure she'll talk more about that today. Please do type any questions you have into the chat, and I'll be monitoring that. And if it is something that's very time sensitive, um, I may interrupt Carol to ask the question. Otherwise, I'll save them up for the end and we'll go through them all then. And then maybe at the end, Carol and I will have more of a short conversation about some of these plants that she talks about. So without further ado, we'll let you start screen sharing, Carol. And
okay.
um, whoops. And let's see. Actually, Bob, do you do that? Yes.
No, I got it.
Ah, okay. Thank you very much. We are being ably assisted by Bob Finkel, one of our longtime docents and volunteers here at the garden, with a lot of the logistics of this. And so, Carol, take it away.
Well, all of a sudden there it is. There we go. Okay. And I want to do, what do I want to do here? I want to minimize, well, okay. Can you see my screen? You good?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank Bart for inviting me to be a speaker in this lecture series. It's been it's actually a year or two since I joined you when we had our conversation about various horticultural topics. I don't even remember the substance of it, but I know we had a good time. So today, I look forward to talking to you about some of the plants that I've been responsible for bringing into the nursery trade so that they can be of use to home gardeners, professional landscape designers, anybody interested in California native plants. And some of the plants I'm going to start off with, actually, I'll just dive right into this, are plants that I didn't actually find in a garden or in the wild, but they were selected by other people, and I will provide those kinds of details. But if they needed to be brought into the nursery trade in order for people to be aware of them. And so that was part of my responsibility when I was at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden in charge of the plant introduction program. So I'm going to start with my time at SBBG. And here's an older image of the meadow and the Santa Ynez Mountains in the background, which I imagine many of the people listening in today have visited and experienced themselves. It's always a beautiful image, no matter what's going on in the foreground. It's still a great setting. So this was the person who was responsible for getting me to California from Michigan, which is where I grew up. This is one of the former directors of SBBG, Ralph Philbrick. Do you have this little bar of a taskbar on the screen? Are you just seeing the images, Bart?
Just the images.
Okay, good, because I've got this annoying little taskbar I can't get rid of. And he was very interested in the horticultural uses of native plants. He actually was responsible for a couple of very well-known cultivars, such as Canyon Prince, Alamus Canyon Prince, that you see here in this image, which was actually taken at the Nature Gardens at the Natural History Museum. So I had nothing to do with selecting or introducing this, but just to share with you some of the other people at SBBG who were involved in the plant introduction program. So Ralph, the other plant that you might know that he was responsible for selecting in the wild was Artemisia Canyon Gray. And both that and the Alamus are from the Channel Islands. And then, of course, Dara Emery, who was the garden's horticulturist for over 30 years. He was my mentor when I first came to the Botanic Garden in 1981. And when I was hired as the plant propagator, he was able to devote all of his time to his various breeding projects. And the one that most people would be familiar with is his work with the genus Heuchera. By the time I had gotten there, I think a few years into my tenure, he introduced Heuchera Canyon Delight, which is still one of the more popular cultivars in the trade, and then Canyon Pink, which was its lighter pink counterpart. And when Dara passed away in, I believe it was 1991 or 2, he was still working on Heucheras in an emeritus status. And there were several of his plants that were in the test plot and also in the nursery that were just too beautiful to, throw away. And so with the input of the plant propagator at the time, because I was the director of horticulture by then, and one of our dedicated volunteers, we selected what I thought were the 4 of the best of the cultivars, prospective cultivars that he had been working on. And we came up with the name Canyon Quartet Series for the 4 that we chose. And you're looking at 2 of them in the upper right. Canyon Pink is the first generation. Canyon Duet is the lighter, sort of bicolored one in that image. And in the wheelbarrow are all 4. So it was Canyon Duet, Canyon Melody, Canyon Bell, and Canyon Chimes. And so kind of playing off of the quartet, musical quartet, that's where they all had some musical connotation. And some of those are remain popular and in production, but a few of them have almost disappeared. And actually, thanks to you, Bart, I still haven't gotten that plant from you yet on behalf of SBBG, but Canyon Melody, the garden lost it. And they've been trying to get it back into their collection, and Bart, through one of your colleagues, has found a plant. So we'll get that one back to the Botanic Garden so they can bulk up on that again. But they're really beautiful when they're all grown together, in my estimation. These are plants that, for those of you who have grown the colorful heucheras, you know that they are not summer drought tolerant, unless you maybe live in very far northern California in the coastal zone. They do need some supplemental water in the summertime to stay healthy. Another one of the plants that Dara had been working on in his breeding program was the genus Fremontodendron. And he was trying to find a smaller scale form of the hybrids that had already been introduced into the trade between Californica and Mexicanum, and such as Canyon Glory and Pacific Sunset and San Gabriel. There were a few of these low-growing ones already out there, but he was hoping to find another, and he did. He found this beautiful hybrid that I named after he passed away. It was growing again in the test plot, and I distributed cuttings to a bunch of nurseries. We named it after him and called it Dara's Gold. And what distinguishes it from some of the other ones, like Ken Taylor and El Dorado Gold, West Hills Hybrid, very shiny leaves and quite bright yellow flowers. This is a plant on the left in a garden in Altadena that's been loosely trained up this wooden fence, but left to its own devices, it is fairly low growing, maybe about 3 to 4 feet tall and several feet across. So if you're lucky, you can still find it in the nursery trade, but it's not easy to come by. Another plant that Dara was responsible for collecting cuttings from the wild is what I consider to be one of the very best ground cover manzanitas. And to this day, I will share with you my frustration that this is not in the nursery trade, with just a very few exceptions. I just don't get it. So if there's any nursery people out there, I encourage you to start propagating and making this plant more widely available. It's from the Hearst Ranch property, or adjacent to Hearst Ranch property in San Luis Obispo County. And it's a selection of Arctostaphylos hookeri, used to be called hookeri subspecies Hirstiorum. Bart, you can correct me if that's not the current nomenclature anymore. But it's a beautiful, low, sprawling form with light pink flowers. You can see that in the close-up. And the image on the upper left is from the garden of the property where I now live. My friends planted this in their front yard many, many years ago, cascading over this sandstone retaining wall. And then on the lower right, it's being grown in a fairly large container with some other plants at SPBG. It has a little bit of a grayish cast to the foliage. And compared to many of the other ground cover manzanitas that are in the trade, which tend to be from further north, Monterey County and further north still, this one I consider to be much more summer drought tolerant than the other ones because of where it comes from. Even though it was a coastal site, it seems to do well in some of the inland valley areas as well. The original plant, which was planted in 1972, is still growing at the Botanic Garden. So, and it's easy to propagate. So it's just got a lot going for it. I'm sure everybody knows about Iris Canyon Snow, the Pacific Coast hybrid iris that's in the upper left. That also is attributed to Dara. He grew that from a batch of seed that he got from, I believe it was the Pacific Iris Society. And he selected that one and shared that with, at least with Nevin Smith when Nevin was at Wintergreen Nursery. And I think Nevin may have been the one to name it. You know, I'm going to have to go back and look at my reference notes on that. But Canyon Snow's been around for a very long time. Has those beautiful milky white petals with the yellow eye spots. It's a really durable cultivar. And Dara used that in his iris breeding program. So that was a selection from a batch of seed. I think the seed packet was labeled Iris de Glaciana alba. And he, as I said, he selected this one from the seeds that he grew, and he used it and hybridized it with some cultivars, one of which I believe was from Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, now California Botanic Garden. And he came up with this beautiful, large flowered, purple blushed selection that I named after Dara. Again, these are ones that I named after Dara passed away. So that's Canyon Bliss, in honor of the woman who the Botanic Garden was originally named for, Anna Dorinda Blakesley Bliss. And then Canyon Sunshine on the lower left, equally large, lovely yellow saturated flowers, just because of the color that suggested the word sunshine. And Canyon was part of the name of many Botanic Garden introductions, which was something that the director, Ralph Philbrick, had recommended we start using because it tied us to our location in Mission Canyon. So these two newer cultivars, we sent propagation material or some starts to cornflower farms to get them to bulk up on these in some quantity so that we could then distribute them to other nurseries for production. And that happened while I was still at the Botanic Garden, and we did officially introduce them. Can't tell you what year. I don't remember that specifically. It was in the 2000s, I believe. And then they kind of fell off the production lists. And I believe that Keith Nevison, who's the director of horticulture at the garden now, is working up numbers again. I know that there's occasionally they have Canyon Sunshine for sale, and I'm not sure what's going on with Canyon Bliss. So I hope that they still have that in the collection and are going to be able to bulk that one back up again for reintroduction. The two, I think, equally beautiful selections that can get tied back to the work that Dara did. So on to some of the things that I'm more directly responsible for. Many years ago, when I was on a collecting trip on Santa Cruz Island with the garden's herbarium curator, Steve Junak, I was out walking actually on my own one day and came across this population of island ceanothus, Ceanothus arboreus, on one of the very windswept ridge tops on the island. And there were a couple of plants that were very decumbent. And I assumed that it was from the wind, keeping them fairly low in profile. And I took cuttings of both of them and propagated them at the garden. And one of them we eventually named and called Powder Blue for the light blue color. Unfortunately, the habit did not persist. As you can see in that image on the right, just with the scale of some of those agaves in the foreground, it did grow to be about 6 or so feet tall and even wider. But it also had these somewhat pendulous, drooping flower clusters. And I was encouraged by Dave Frost from Native Sons Nursery to go ahead and name it anyway, because it was different from the other island ceanothus that were in the trade. So it was distributed to nurseries in our trial network, which is just a diversion for a moment. I did kind of formalize the Gardens Plant Introduction Program while I was the director of horticulture. And we invited a number of botanic gardens and wholesale nursery growers to help us to evaluate plants that we thought had horticultural merit, so that we weren't exclusively naming them based on our experience with them at the Botanic Garden, but instead finding out from other locations, well, how easily did they propagate? How well did they do in various microclimates across the state? And I think we had 8 or 9 different partners in that endeavor. And sometimes, we got a thumbs down. It's like, no, we're not too keen on this one, which didn't mean that we were not going to introduce something. We just knew that maybe this was only going to be good for the Santa Barbara gardening public and not elsewhere. But most of the time we got, a consensus that was in favor of the things that we were distributing, but not always. Anyway, Powder Blue is occasionally available. It didn't, become wildly popular like so many other ceanothus are, but if you do come across it, I encourage you to try it. It is a very handsome plant, but not as low as I had hoped. Here's a desert species that I selected from Joshua Tree on, I believe it was private property. I hope it was private property. I don't remember, quite frankly, but this is from, out in the wild, a very, very silvery white more rounded leafed selection of our desert lavender, which used to be Hyptis and now it's Condia. The flower color is a fairly good purplish blue. The flower color on Hyptis or desert lavender varies from a really washed out blue to even more intense than this, but it was the foliage that is what caught my eye that distinguished it from all of the other plants that I was seeing on that particular visit to the desert. And so propagated it from cuttings and distributed to the network and eventually named this one Silver Lining. And this one is still being grown by a number of nurseries. It does have the suggestion of the lavender scent as the European species of lavender provide, not quite as sweet, but still, I think, very pleasing and visited by native bees besides honeybees, the European honeybees, but butterflies visit these flowers as well. And I've even seen, despite the tiny, tiny size of these flowers, I've even seen hummingbirds visit these flowers. So it's, I think, a beautiful, upright, very silvery plant that is best probably sited in the hottest, sunniest, driest part of your garden, and preferably next to a path where you can appreciate the fragrance from the foliage. Another silvery white plant that I selected from within the Botanic Gardens living collections is this island snowflake. Is one of the common names. Used to be Eriophyllum and now it's Constantia. We named this one Canyon Silver. It's super deeply divided foliage, as you can see here in this image. The original plant was not even labeled in the garden. It was just kind of hidden in the background in what is still the Manzanita section of the Botanic Garden. And as I was out one day getting cuttings for propagating for the living collections, I just saw this silvery leafed plant in the shadows. And it wasn't looking all that great, but it had some decent new growth on it. And I took cuttings and they readily propagated, and I started planting it in other places around the garden to see how it would do. And it did quite well in several different locations, obviously better in the sun, where it could become more full and dense and actually even flower. I didn't know what the flowers were like when I took, the original cuttings. And I also did have the opportunity to grow different sources of this particular species that we got from other nurseries. And in my estimation, based on their experience growing them at the Botanic Garden, this one seemed to be more durable and adaptable to a wide array of soil types and water regimes. And I felt that it was worth naming and introducing. And this was before we had the formal introduction program. So we did. We gave it the name Canyon Silver and distributed it eventually to nurseries that were interested. And it is out there in the trade, but so is just, the unnamed species, Eriophyllum or Constantia navinii. And sometimes these get mixed up. So you may buy something that's called Canyon Silver and it really isn't. Even I sometimes have gotten confused, but it's that super deeply divided foliage, I think, that sets it apart. Here it is planted at the Nature Gardens with what used to be considered a non-native grass. That's Muhlenbergia emerslii in the background, which has recently been determined to be a native to California, which I'm thrilled about because it's one of my favorite grasses. And then you might notice there's some stems of Nevin barberry in the foreground, Berberis navinii. So here you get to see the yarrow-like flowers, that deep golden yellow, starting to fade to what I think is actually its most beautiful stage when these seeds turn deep chocolate brown against that stunning silvery foliage. I just think that's fantastic. So I love this plant for that contrast. It does flower in the summer, extending the season of bloom. And then when you get this chocolate color that will persist for several months until you cut that back. Visited by butterflies and bees, and I'm sure other beneficial insects as well. This is an island endemic species that's found on several of the Channel Islands. I don't know which one canyon silver comes from because we had no records of that original plant that I propagated from. Catalina silver lace is the other common name. I think you can tell that I like silver-leafed foliage because here's the third one in a row. This one is also from the wild. This was a selection that I made on a collecting trip in the 1980s. This is from the Monterey coast, within splashing distance of the ocean, on the coastal bluffs in Monterey County. And this is, we originally introduced it with the genus of Corythrogeny, and it got changed to Lysingea, and now it's back to Corythrogeny. So you'll see it on nursery availability and botanic garden lists with both of those names. And the cultivar name is silver carpet. It does make this very low sprawling carpet of handsome gray foliage, silver gray foliage. And then in the summer and fall, it can just be almost completely carpeted with these icy purplish pink flowers that are visited by bees and butterflies. So another season extender in our gardens. And even though it was discovered in an incredibly coastal location, it has done well in some inland gardens too. Here it is in a garden in Santa Barbara in the foreground with Ceanothus maritimus frosty dawn, and behind that is Salvia Point Sal just getting ready to flower. And I believe that that was one or two plants. I designed this garden many, many years ago, and I don't recall how many plants, but silver carpet can get easily 6 feet across under favorable conditions. Related to that is another introduction that what came through the Botanic Garden, not my selection, but one that I helped to distribute and get into the nursery trade. This was selected by a former trustee of the Botanic Garden, Michael Benedict, from another somewhat coastal, but a little bit further inland location in Santa Barbara County. Much more upright, as you can see, those branches are tending upward, and it will eventually make a mound that gets to be between 2 and 3 feet tall and wide. But the same purplish pink flowers. Here you can't see those flowers because they're I think this plant is still in bud, but it's a nice companion to Eriogonum grandirubescens, which is in flower in this image. This was also taken at the Nature Gardens. And in this case, the grass in the background is our native deer grass, Muhlenbergia rigens. And we named this, actually one of our gardeners, when we decided to introduce this, we always had, a little friendly competition to come up with names, and he called it Smart Aster, tongue in cheek, firmly planted in cheek. And it's occasionally available in nurseries and botanic gardens, but not nearly as popular as silver carpet. Another plant from the wild, I selected this ages and ages ago from a Botanic Garden sponsored trip to the Baja Channel Islands. This one was from Cedros Island. It used to be Galvesia, now it's Gambellia juncea, with those juncus-like stems, smaller red flowers, but still tubular, like its relative Gambellia speciosa, but very rush-like stems, and can flower almost year-round. You can see a close-up of a single flower, and then growing in a container at the Botanic Garden. And this one came from the Grand Canyon, a location on Cedros Island. I think Bart has also named another selection of this plant. And here, just to give you a sense of habitat, an image from that same canyon on Cedros Island. These plants can get pretty big. They can occasionally root sucker and become almost like a thicket. And the hummingbirds absolutely love these flowers. Best in full sun, although they'll tolerate a little bit of shade.
Yes, and cutting back is oftentimes a good idea.
Yes.
Um, and I did not select any, but the other thing is there should be a tilde over the N of Canyon.
Yes, there should, but I don't know how to do that. So
Just mentioning that for the listeners.
yes, thank you.
And somebody did ask about the corothrogeny. Um, does it need some supplemental summer watering? The person mentioned that it didn't last more than 2 seasons.
Ooh, well, that of course depends on where where you have planted it. Um, it will tolerate some occasional water in the summertime. If you're in a hot inland area, then yes, I would say you would need to give it some for it to be happy, based on its, its origins along the immediate coast. But
And
it's low water, you're not going to water that regularly. So occasional, maybe deep waterings in the summertime. And it does also benefit from being cut back, at least around the margins, to retain some fullness in the center. So
I find it needs to be cut back hard.
you can, yes,
Um,
but not necessarily every year, just when it starts to open up.
yeah, and if it gets too frost uh, bitten, because even at Rancho, sometimes it got frosted.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah,
that
and
doesn't surprise me. Yeah,
and that it just doesn't look as good then. But
right.
we've just waited until later in the year and then just cut it back hard, and it would usually just come back profusely.
Okay.
And the question was from up here.
Oh,
Another person had a question about silver carpet as well. Someone who attended one of your TPF classes and asking, is silver carpet the one you wanted to show them at the Gottlieb Garden?
oh, I don't remember that. So,
Okay.
yeah, sorry, I
And
don't remember.
and then the one other thing I would just point out is that Canyon Silver is your background.
No, actually, I think it's not.
It's not? Okay. Sorry about that. I
I
thought
was
must
scrutinizing
be.
all my photographs. I mean, I thought it was, when in preparing this presentation, I was looking at every single one of my quote unquote Canyon Silver images of Constancia to see if I had mislabeled some of my images. And I am not 100% convinced that my background photo is Canyon Silver. The foliage doesn't appear to be quite as dissected as the ones that I know absolutely are Canyon Silver. But it's a great photo anyway, and I'm not going to change it. So,
Okay, and there are two other questions, quick, and then there's some big questions that I'm saving for the end. But can you mention, just as you're going through, which plants can or need to be cut back hard on an annual or occasional basis? And the other question was, does cutting back hard simulate deer browsing? And should she cut back heterotheca? And I would say, yes, you can cut back heterotheca pretty hard in the winter. But do you want to address the simulation of deer browsing? And then I will bow out till later.
uh, I would think that deer, if you've cut something back really hard and you've got this flush of very lush new growth, would be very appetizing, enticing to deer. So yeah, I think you run the risk of having that happen. Um, I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, I think, of course, it's going to depend on the other plants in your garden, whether they're going to make a beeline for the juicy new foliage, or if there's something else that they just naturally prefer. And of course, it depends on what plants we're talking about here. I bet you have more experience with deer, Bart, than I do. That was not a huge problem Well, it was not a problem at all at the nature gardens. We didn't have deer there. We did at the Botanic Garden, but most of the deer browse was on Ceanothus, and not a whole lot else. They really, because they had so much to choose from in the Ceanothus collection, that was their primary source of food when they ventured into the garden. But I know that they love a whole lot of other things. It just depends on where you are and what else is in your garden. So
Actually, I had one other follow-up question on their Ceanothus comment there, and that is, was it principally the Euceanothus group, or was it also the Cerastes or buckbrush types?
principally Euceanothus. The Cerastes tended to be eaten more by the rats. Um, the wood rats, they would go for that and more heavily. Yeah, so it was mostly the Euceanothus that were browsed. Definitely more so than the other. Occasionally there'd be a little bit of nibble on the Cerastes, but it was mostly Euceanothus. So thanks for asking that. Yeah. I did want to say one more thing about the Corythrogeny silver carpet. As far as usage, um, I thought I had a really good image of it growing in a container from my own garden. And I didn't, so I didn't include it, but I do want to just mention that as a possibility. I've had a plant in a container, the same container, for several years now. And I added Eriogonum wrightii to the pot a few years ago, and they're a wonderful complement to each other. And every year I do cut the silver carpet back pretty hard to maintain its bushy habit. And so it does require more water because it's in a container, but that is an effective and attractive use of that plant if you don't have a lot of space. So, okay, a few salvias to talk about. So when I first came across this plant in the wild, which is from Santa Barbara County, at the same location as Salvia Point Sal and Salvia Point Sal Spreader, one of which was introduced by San Marcos Growers and the other was introduced by Native Sons Nursery. I saw this plant, this individual plant, in this sea, and I'm just going to skip forward just to give you an idea of this is not the location. This is actually inland Santa Barbara County. But if you see that gray mass of purple sage in the center and then a little bit in the foreground, just to suggest this huge coastal slope covered with purple sage out at Point Sal, which is a really fascinating location along the immediate coast of northern Santa Barbara County. So those other two cultivars had come from there, but in this sea of purple sage, there was this dark pinkish purple plant that it just was like flashing lights. And somehow made my way to that individual plant, took cuttings of it, brought it back to the Botanic Garden, and of course started distributing it around the garden to see how it would do. And like the other two selections, very durable, reliable, easy to propagate plant. It did not maintain the lower growing habit that it had presented in the wild once it was away from the coastal bluffs and the salt spray and the wind. It got quite a bit taller, more like 4 to 5 feet tall, and it also naturally air layered. And so an individual plant, depending on the location in the garden, could easily get 6 to 8 feet across as it kept, spreading over time. So it can potentially cover a lot of ground, which would be great if you have, if you're looking for a large scale slope planting, for example. But besides all of that, it's the flower color that is, I think, its greatest attraction, the more rich color than Point Sal and Point Sal Spreader. And I actually pulled out the Royal Horticultural Society color charts to come up with the name of Amethyst Bluff, because that was the color that most closely matched the charts. So, and like the other two selections of purple sage, these do benefit, as do many of our woody sages, from annual pruning to keep them fairly bushy and dense. But coppicing is, certainly not something you would do on a regular basis. Taking maybe 20 to 30% off every year. So that's Point Sal. And then this lovely light yellow colored selection of hummingbird sage was brought to the garden by one of our long-term docents, whose name just happened to be Avis Keaty. She discovered this near Lake Cachuma, which is in Santa Barbara County, a small population of it growing among the more typical magenta colored hummingbird sage. And she asked me if I might be interested in propagating it for the garden. And of course I said yes. And so she brought us a couple of cuttings, or maybe they were divisions. I don't remember right now. It's been a long time. But needless to say, it did well in the garden, and we shared it with our network. We ended up naming it in her honor. It has sort of limey green bracts, and then these yellow flowers that fade to a pale yellow with time, but a really handsome alternative, especially if you're fond of yellow flowers. And it's a pretty tough plant in the garden. It does very well by all accounts. And so not as easy to get in the nursery trade, but occasionally it's out there. And the Botanic Garden, I hope, is propagating it. They have several sizable populations of it in the garden now. Does beautifully in the dappled shade underneath coast live oaks. Another salvia, this one also from Cedros Island, and again attributed to Michael Benedict. This is Cedros Island sage, a white flowered form, which I named Baja Blanca. This is typically a very pretty blue flowered, small scale sage with very aromatic foliage that a lot of people don't really like. I do. I tell everybody to take a whiff of it. It reminds me of chopped liver, which, due to my Jewish heritage, I grew up with. And I like it. I think it's a really handsome small plant with these dainty white blossoms and kind of rounded form. It definitely benefits from being cut back. And this can be fussy. In my experience, it really wants very good drainage and full sun to thrive. Here it is in a slightly raised planter at the home demonstration garden in Santa Barbara with Artemisia David's Choice.
We do grow that one here on a clay slope, and it does very nicely.
How many years old are your plants?
It's probably at least 5 by now.
Oh, wow. That's good.
And it's not as full as your plant. But the other thing for people to know is that this is not in the group of salvias that all the rest of the California salvias are in. This is in the section Kalos face, which is all of the Mexican salvias other than Salvia californica that are just native to California.
But it is in the floristic province.
Yes, it is, but it's just an anomaly. It's not as woody. The flower structure is actually different. And so horticulturally, it's a different creature than most of our others.
And do you cut your plant back periodically? Do you give it a light trim?
Not very often.
Okay.
And it's growing in partial shade.
Oh, wow. That surprises me.
Yeah, I know at my house, it's not survived in containers. I think I need to put it in even more sun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've tried it in containers as well as in the ground. I mean, it can be a little bit fussy. And I noticed that some of the plants over the years that there is some critter that lays its eggs in the flowers. And I've never been able to figure out what it is. So you don't always get the nice floral display that you might like. But that's, just been my limited experience. I don't know if that's a common occurrence or not. But it's a really cool little plant. And I think it, would lend itself well to being in a rock garden too, just because of its size.
Yeah, and
Tops out at about, 18 inches.
yeah, and I think it would be good in a container in general.
Right.
But I think it also may need a little bit of more feeding than our native sages do.
Mm.
Because I generally really can abuse our native sages and there's never a problem. This one I abuse and it's dead.
Good to know. Okay, one more stage. So here's another one that I selected. In this case, from the Botanic Garden. This was a volunteer that showed up in our former Dudleya display. And our Director of Conservation and Research at the time, Dieter Wilken, keyed this for me and determined that it was most likely a hybrid of Santa Rosa island sage, Salvia brandegii, and Salvia munzii. It has this flower color on this, at least what I'm seeing on my screen, is a little bit off. It's more blue than purple. I don't know what you're seeing on your screens, but it's a nice shade of blue. The flowers are not huge, but they're abundant, and it has a pretty long flowering season. This plant can get fairly large, easily 4 feet tall, 3 to 4 feet tall, and wide or wider. Has aromatic foliage. Same appeal to hummingbirds as most of our other sages. Bees will visit the flowers as well. And this one definitely does benefit from being cut back on an annual basis to keep it, not only more, bushy in overall form, but to promote better flowering the next year round. But a pretty easy to cultivate plant. We put several of these on the living wall in the nature gardens, and they just thrived and bloomed periodically throughout the year. Okay, a different genus. So here is a mallow that's from coastal Baja that was collected from one of the Botanic Garden's former horticulturists and brought back to us to propagate. He gave us a couple of cuttings that rooted very readily. We started planting it around the garden, and it did quite well. It was identified, and this might have been thanks to your help, Bart. I think it might have been somebody at Rancho who determined that this was the species Sphaerelsia fulva. Beautiful and copious display of white flowers, occasionally tinged with a little bit of pink. And the white suggested the name La Luna for the moon. Probably should have been plural, but anyway. Very generous flowering. And for people who have trouble growing the desert species, Sphaerelsia ambigua, if you're living in a more coastal, cooler environment, because this plant does come from the coast, it's a nice alternative, although of course it doesn't have that wonderful red-orange color. But a very satisfying plant, rusty colored stems, as you can see in the close-up. It will get about 3 feet tall and wide, maybe even bigger. Here it is in a garden down in Downey in Southern California, inland, doing quite well. There's Eriogonum giganteum in the background for scale. And I'm pretty sure this picture is at Tilden. Does that look like a familiar plant and location, Dara? I mean, Bart, I think I took this.
Yes,
Tilden.
that is here
Okay.
next to the building that I'm sitting in.
Okay. Yep, that's what I thought. I just didn't label my slide. So it does well for you up there.
Yes, but like many malvaceous plants, it tends to be relatively short-lived. I mean, or it needs more intervention. It's another plant that probably should get cut back hard, because if you don't, it kind of blooms itself out, and then you need to start over. I mean, kind of like a lot of the Malacathamnuses and many of the other kind of woody, semi-woody Sphaeroleas. But what do you think?
Well, I think in general, yes. The mallows, the Butylon palmari, Sphaerolesia, they all benefit from being cut back after flowering to stimulate more interior growth so that they stay, more dense in habit and promote, a good flowering season the next time around. Yeah. I don't think they have to be cut to the ground necessarily unless they've gotten super leggy, but maybe a third to a half, depending on, what your preference is.
Yeah, I agree. As long as you get rid of the entire old inflorescence
Yes, yes,
and a little bit more.
right.
You don't want to cut into
Old
old
wood.
wood.
No. And when you see Sphaerolesia ambigua in the desert, I don't know about you, but and I've looked at these many times over the years. I don't ever see plants with super thick, trunks. I don't think there's super long live plants in the wild either.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Okay. So on to herbaceous and herbal plant. Yet another selection that I made from the living collections at SBBG. We had several individual colonies of California aster, Aster chilensis, now Symphyotrichum, growing in the meadow. And this particular one stood out from the others because it was a much brighter, darker purple. And so I felt that it was deserving of some greater attention. We propagated this and distributed this to, I don't know if we distributed to the network. I guess we did. Super easy to cultivate. You can see here it's really nice, partnered with California goldenrod, and there's some Elemis Canyon prints hooking up in the background. Like other plants of California aster, it spreads by rhizomes. It benefits from some supplemental water in the summer to stay greener longer and to produce more copious flowers. So not super summer drought tolerant, but it definitely is another season extender, flowering in the summer and on into the fall. And lots of insects visit these flowers. Again, there's the ubiquitous European honeybee there, but native bees and butterflies visit these flowers as well. And this one definitely should be cut back when it's done flowering and taken all the way down to the ground so that you get nice, fresh, new shoots the next season. And the more water you give this, probably the more rapidly it will spread. But it's not so aggressive that you can't keep it in check. Whereas I would not say the same thing about California goldenrod. Be careful where you plant that. Probably one of the most popular of the cultivars that I selected is this one right here. Verbena lilacina de lamina. It's just so much fun to say that. It's from Cedros Island, from Cañada de la Mina, hence the cultivar name. This also was collected from that same trip to Cedros Island as the Galvizia Grand Canyon back in the 90s. And this individual plant was along one of the trails. And what was most notable about it was the flower color. It was a much darker purple than all of the other plants that I saw in that canyon. So a couple of cuttings, and I guess the rest is history. I was about to distribute it to all of our network members, and Dave Frost, when he saw the plant in the Botanic garden, he said, "Don't bother, just name it." because he knew that it was going to be very well received, which it was. It can bloom almost year round, which is true of the species. That's not this, unique to De la Mina. Lilac verbena is a very floriferous, free-flowering plant. The flowers are sweetly scented. It's easy to grow. It does best in full sun, but will tolerate a little bit of shade. And as you can see, butterflies nectar on the flowers, as this swallowtail is so beautifully illustrating. It does benefit from being cut back hard after flowering, again, to promote a better shape. So even if it still has some late flowers, just get in there and cut it back to revitalize it. And just to show the contrast with another selection that Bart actually named, Paseo Rancho, which I think is equally as beautiful and has even slightly larger inflorescences, here the two of them are growing together, which I think is a nice combination. So you can have your cake and eat it too. So that's,
Carol, a
yes.
quick question there about cutting back.
Yeah.
I've had very checkered luck with cutting this back hard. Sometimes it just doesn't come back, it dies. I've usually ended up having to take a lot more time and kind of thin it back. But what time are you actually cutting it back hard? Because it blooms basically year round.
Right. I've cut it back when I felt like I had to cut it back hard. It was in the late summer or fall, when the flowering seems to be tapering off considerably, especially if you haven't done much in the way of any summer supplemental irrigation, which it doesn't need, but will take. But most of the time I don't cut it back really hard. I just do what you just mentioned, cut it back maybe 20 to 30%. I can imagine that if you haven't cut it on an annual basis and then you take it back really hard, it might not respond, which happens with other plants as well. If you go rad after several years of no pruning, they don't always have the capacity to rebound. So it's a wishy-washy answer, but I think it's probably better to just do a partial cutback on an annual basis instead of coppicing.
Okay, good to know, because again, I see even in the chat, other people are mentioning that they've had difficulty as well with cutting it back. So I guess we'll all try doing something more in the fall.
Yeah.
Although up here, just before the rainy season and the cold season, I'm not sure how that'll work out, but certainly in Southern California,
right,
it'll probably be fine.
Yeah, you are a different climate zone, so you may have to adjust for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's also a question there that I'll just answer now. It's about Paseo Rancho. It was a selection from a group of seedlings, and it's anything with that name should be grown by cuttings only.
Right. And you selected that, right? I was right.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I
I was at Rancho Santa Ana,
okay.
now California Botanic Garden.
Right.
And one other thing, just so I don't forget, Vivian New mentioned that Salvia Spathacea avis Keaty is available from the Santa Clara Valley chapter of CNPS at their plant sales and at their nursery.
Do you have that at Tilden?
No. Well, yes, we have it in the nursery. Have not planted it out.
You can, because it was wild collected.
Yes, I know, and that's why I have it.
Okay, good.
And why I brought it to the garden. I guess the other thing to point out about verbena, and it's unfortunate, but it's now glandularia.
Oh yeah, I know. I did not put that
Glandularia lilacina de la mina doesn't trip off the tongue quite as nicely as Verbena lilacina.
No, it does not. That's why you didn't see it in my garden.
Yes, and I kind of agree. It's easier to just call it Verbena.
Right.
That,
Okay, what do I got here? All right, so chaparral nightshade, Solanum xanthii, which is only one eye, not two. Sometimes you see it misspelled. Um, so this is post Botanic Garden. This is after I left SPBG. And I'm pretty sure it was the Jesucita fire, one of the many fires that we've had in this area, 2009, I think. I was out hiking on Mountain Drive, which is just one of the foothill areas here in Santa Barbara, and came across an individual of chaparral nightshade with deep purple flowers. Near some of the more typical, lighter purple specimens. And I took a few cuttings of it. And at that point in time, I was like I said, I wasn't at the garden. I gave the cuttings to Randy Baldwin at San Marcos Growers. He proceeded to grow it. And when he was ready to introduce it, we decided that Mountain Pride seemed like an appropriate name based on its location on Mountain Drive. And this has become a pretty popular selection that is available at a number of commercial nurseries. The image that you see here is in a garden down in Pasadena, growing with bladder pod and monkey flower. This is Barbara Eisenstein's garden. Barbara is the author of, and I'm not going to remember the name of her book. Bart, do you remember the name of her book? It's a wonderful book about growing California native plants. Anyway, she's had this plant in her garden for many, many years, and it slowly moves around. It has rhizomes, doesn't ever get out of control, but it has persisted for several years. It can be a little bit fussy because I think it doesn't like much in the way of summer water, and so you could kill it with kindness. I have seen it in super large containers. They had it at the Huntington Botanic Garden in Bart, you may remember this when they had the Out of the Wild art exhibit with all kinds of imagery of California native plants at one of their art galleries, and they had this in a fantastic container outside the gallery. So it's a handsome, deep purple flower colored form of chaparral nightshade. And then another plant from that very same outing where I found the solanum is this bright orange flowered climbing penstemon, Kekiella cordifolia. Again, I gave cuttings to Randy. He propagated this and we named it Mountain Flare. We were going to say Mountain Flame. I kept going back and forth. Either one would have been fine, but we went with Flare. He only grew it for a couple of seasons, I think, and so it never really got out there into the nursery trade. So I doubt that this is even exists anymore. It's probably one for the ages. But there are other orange flowered specimens out there in the wild. I've seen them once in a while, and I think it would be fun for this to get back in, if not this particular plant, because the genetics of this one, are probably gone, but others to complement the reds that are more commonly seen in the wild, especially for people who like orange flowers.
yes. Carol, we have a number of different color forms from orange to pure yellow of Kekiella cordifolia. It just seeds around the garden and we get all these different color forms.
Well, why don't you name some that are really particularly tough?
Yes, well, and at Rancho, there were the two that got named that were actually the hybrids between cordifolia and
And Carinoides.
antrinifolia.
Right.
Yeah, antrinoides, correct. And that they were Philip Munns and Dick Straw, as I recall.
And those are really nice plants, but you can't get them. I mean,
Yeah, they're hard to find.
right.
The other thing uh, from the chat is somebody did type in, thank you, Michelle, that Barbara Eisenstein's book title is Wild Suburbia,
Oh, thank you.
and it is very good, especially for people getting started.
Yep.
And then somebody asked for the name of the monkey flower in the picture from Barbara's garden. Do you
I think
happen to
it's
know?
Trish. I think it's Trish,
Ah,
but I'm
yes,
not sure. I'm not sure.
it does look like Trish now that
Yeah.
you mention that.
Yeah.
And then let's see. There's also another comment. I'll just read this. Carol, given you mentioned bladderpod, are you aware that this species with both east-west and north-south distributions have three subspecies in Jepson? I've recently learned that the desert subspecies is summer deciduous instead of evergreen, question mark. Could you please comment on this wonderful UC Davis All-Star plant, pollinator plant?
I love Paratoma. I hate that name. And at one point it was even Cleome, I think. Isomerus arborea. Yeah. It's a fantastic plant because it's one that can bloom intermittently throughout the year. Hummingbirds visit it, butterflies visit it, other beneficial insects, I'm sure. There's a whole host of things. And then I don't know who eats the seeds, but certainly they're going to be eaten by some wild creatures. And apparently you can actually eat them yourself as well if they're cooked. I know it's not as popular as other native shrubs, partly because it has a bit of a off-putting scent. But that doesn't bother me personally. I think it's an underappreciated native shrub. So,
Yeah, and we have actually two of the subspecies here at Tilden. Interestingly, in the past, I believe Steve Edwards had said it really wasn't growable here.
hmm,
And so it's just more of climate change. We can grow it here, but the plants oftentimes, particularly those in the Southern California section, do not look particularly happy.
hmm,
They do go semi-deciduous here. And even though that collection is from Western Fresno County, the ones from the island tend to be better looking throughout the year, at least here. And certainly inland and at Rancho, all of them just did amazingly well. And I think they did also at SBBG, didn't
yeah.
they?
Yeah, there were a lot of at one point in time on the Porter Trail up on the ridge top, there was a fairly sizable colony of them that had quite woody, gnarled trunks, and I've seen that out in the wild. They can actually have some very handsome, sculptural aspect to them as they get older. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of genetic variability. I don't personally know the botanical distinctions between all those different subspecies, but just based on its tremendously wide range, it makes sense that there's a lot of different forms and variations in how they perform in gardens as well. But yeah, it's a really great species. Okay, so now we're moving on to the nature gardens, and I need to give a shout out to Michelle Sullivan, who is in the audience today. She is actually the person who is largely responsible for getting the nature gardens off the ground. She was the principal designer who worked with, who was a partner in the firm Miller and Associates, which is now MLA Studio. They were the landscape architectural firm that created the master plan for the 3.5 acre nature gardens, working in close collaboration with several of the staff at the museum. And once I got hired to be the director of the gardens, I worked very closely with Michelle on installing the different sections of the garden that hadn't already been gotten underway when I was brought on. It was maybe about a third installed when I was hired. And it's thanks to Michelle that I even got that job. Anyway, she was very deeply involved and is a consummate plantswoman herself, as well as a very talented designer. So thank you, Michelle. And so here's an image of, which I believe, this is, I didn't caption this. This is another one of Saxon's images. This is in the pollinator meadow at the Nature Gardens pretty early on. And this section of the gardens was 100% California native. And Michelle and I worked very closely on creating the planting design for this particular section. And there is some Constancia Canyon silver right there in the lower right, along with a bunch of other annual and perennial native plants. And so there were two plants that I selected during my tenure at the museum that I shared. One of them, this one was with San Marcos Growers with Randy Baldwin. This was a seedling of California bush sunflower, Encilia californica, with very pale yellow blossoms and quite wide ray flowers, so the petals, as you can see here. And thanks to a young girl who was whose mother was very close friends with our head gardener at the time, Richard Hayden, a name that may be familiar to many of you. She came up with the name Paleo Yellow. The museum is very widely known for its paleontology research work. And so the paleo is a nod to that, plus the pale color. And the image on the right was taken by Randy Baldwin from some plants he had at the nursery while they were in production. A magnet for all kinds of beneficial insects. That's a very large cactus fly right there, and another one flying in. And so this is a lousy photo. I know you're not supposed to apologize for bad photos, but it's a lousy photo. And the only reason I'm putting it in there is you can see the flower color compared to the more typical brighter yellow of the plant that is adjacent to it in the upper right. So I particularly love this pale yellow color, which was why I was drawn to this plant in the first place. And a few nurseries are producing it, but it's not that easy to come by. I would hope that it might become more widely available in future years. The museum still has several plants in its collection. And I think I gave one to you at some point, didn't I, Bart? You should have it at Tilden, or maybe not. I don't.
Yes, actually, it is planted out fairly near the entrance to the garden.
Oh, good.
In the desert section, and it flowers quite profusely.
Yeah.
It is a plant that, in my opinion, must be cut back
I was
hard
just going to
every
say, Encilia californica in general, I think definitely benefits from a hard pruning for rejuvenation purposes. And you can also sometimes get a second flowering out of it in later summer if you have coppiced it. So
Yeah, even at Rancho, we used to depend on a late fall rebloom
yeah,
of all Encilia californicas
right.
profusely, usually from October through or late October through early December. And then there'd still be blooming, but we'd still cut them back hard, usually in late December or early January. Up here, they're more tender. And so a lot of times we cut them back later because we can really freeze up here at the Botanic Garden.
The other thing you need to keep in mind, though, about cutting it back is you are robbing birds of the opportunity to eat the seeds, as well as get some natural recruitment. So you might want to leave a few stalks, possibly, if you are interested in providing, food for birds and for natural recruitment.
Yeah, one other thing on that though is that in order for seeds to set, you need two different individuals. They're two different clones of Encelia californica or Encelia farinosa because Encelias in general are self-sterile. And so if you only have one and you're the only one in your neighborhood, you're probably not going to get any seed set.
Mhm.
We do get seedlings because we do have Encelia californica El Dorado, and we do have Encelia farinosa, and we do get crosses between all of them
Yeah.
that we usually rogue out. We do grow these plants from cuttings, and they are at our plant sales.
Well, you have to grow the cultivars from cuttings to
Yes,
get the
right.
yeah. Okay.
But
This
we
is the
don't sell the seedling ones that
no,
just come up.
right. Um, so this is the other plant from the nature gardens that showed up in our car park. Um, the car park at the museum is 2 stories, and there were several planter beds in amongst the vehicles to, immediately greet you when you get out of your car. And there was a planting of wood mint, Stachys ballata, in one of those beds. And I don't know if this was part of the original planting or just, a genetic mutation that showed up a few years later. I can't remember when I first saw this, but all of a sudden I noticed there was this white flowering portion of this larger colony. And so I took cuttings, excuse me, and gave them to Tim Becker, who's the director of horticulture at Theodore Payne Foundation. And he propagated it because he was interested in having it as part of their inventory. And after a year or so, had enough material to introduce it, and I gave it the name Moon Glow because of the white flowers. It's not the strongest plant. Sometimes white flowers signify a recessive gene. And so depending, I'm sure, on location, it may or may not thrive. I have one in a container now that I'm trying to figure out where to put it in the ground. Stachys ballata in general can be exceedingly aggressive and spread far and wide in dry situations, which can be quite desirable depending on what your goals and circumstances are. I don't foresee that this one would be anywhere near as strong and tough, but the white flowers are quite pretty and dainty. So I don't expect that this is going to become a super popular plant in the nursery trade, but there it is nonetheless. And on that white flowered variant theme, there are 2 selections of Solanum xanthii that I'm not directly responsible for noticing, but I was out hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains a couple of years ago with Richard before he moved to New York to become the horticulture director of the Highline. And we were hiking in a burned area on one of the popular trails in the Santa Monicas, and there were a couple of white flowered selections, or individuals, I should say, of chaparral nightshade. And I took a couple cuttings. I admit, I took a couple cuttings of each one, gave them to Tim again at Theodore Payne Foundation, and both of them made it. And I'm not sure he's actually officially started selling these through the nursery. I need to check back, but he asked me to name them, and so I did. And so this is one. Blushing Moon has a slight bit of purple still in the flower buds and even in the edges of the petals. I don't know if you can see that very well on your screen, but that's where the blush comes from. And I have this plant in a container here at my garden in Santa Barbara, and it hasn't stopped flowering for the past 6 months in a pot. So I can testify that it makes a really nice container plant. And then the other one, and again, this is a lousy photo, I'm sorry. This is the one that seems to be pure white. And we named this one Moonlight. So just a couple of white variations on the purple chaparral nightshade. Another ceanothus that I selected a long time ago. I was still at the Botanic Garden back then. This is from Point Sal, as you can see from the name. And it was growing on one of the ridge tops above that huge purple sage slope that I mentioned earlier. And what was distinctive about this was, number one, it had very nice bright blue flowers. In the close-up, you can see that this is growing with a flannel bush. Those are the leaves of Fremontodendron in the background. But the other was the habit. As many of you know, there are some low-growing forms of Ceanothus thyrsophloris variety griseus in the trade, the most popular being Yankee Point, which goes back to the 50s. It's been around for that long. And it's a great, reliable, durable native selection. And then there's Hurricane Point as well. But this one was a small plant. It had smaller leaves, and the mature plant was only a couple feet tall and about 3 feet wide. And that was why I felt it was worth trying to propagate and get this one into the trade, because Yankee Point and Hurricane Point can get huge. You know, they can get 8, 10 feet across. And not everybody has the real estate for, you know, or need for a ground cover ceanothus that gets that big. So it did fairly well at the Botanic Garden. The problem with this plant in our nursery, this one kept getting eaten in the nursery at the hort unit by rabbits that got into the nursery. And I think we barely were able to get it out to some of the network members. So that was problematic. Eventually, I gave another round of cuttings to Randy at San Marcos Growers, and he did propagate it for a couple of seasons, but it never really caught on, which is too bad. So I doubt that this is anywhere in the nursery trade. They might still have some plants at the Botanic Garden. I'm just not sure. But I included this just to put it out there that I do think there's still a place for a small form of Thyrsophloris variety griseus in the nursery trade. And then an iris that I actually named when I was at SBBG, but we never really got this one out there. This was from a batch of unnamed rhizomes that we got from Joe Gio, who was the owner of Bayview Nurseries, a native iris specialty nursery. I believe it was in Aptos, and I don't think that still exists anymore. And this one I thought was quite beautiful among all the other ones that he had given us. And we started propagating this and planting it around the garden. And it was a pretty tough clone, but we never distributed it. So I'm sure there are other equally beautiful purple irises. I'm just showing you this because it was part of something that I had my eyes on.
Yeah, Bayview Gardens, that was in Santa Cruz.
Santa
And
Cruz,
I
okay.
think it's still there.
Really? Okay.
I drove by it within the last year, and the rows were still all there.
Wow. Well, you know who's really doing a lot of breeding with our PCH irises today is Bob Sussman at Matilaha Nursery, and he's been coming up with some really stunning selections from his breeding work. So you can check out his website to see what he's been growing. So this is a heartbreak for me. This one got away. This was a seedling, I'm pretty sure, of emerald carpet, Arctostaphylos emerald carpet, that appeared in the Manzanita section of the Botanic Garden, very close to an emerald carpet. I actually had the plant propagator take cuttings off of what I thought was emerald carpet because we needed to bulk up on that in the living collections and also for retail sales. And the plants that came from that group of cuttings turned out to be this very, very small leafed, kind of bonsai form of emerald carpet. Oh, emerald carpet. They didn't have that sprawling low ground cover form at all. And tinier flowers, but very floriferous. You can see the woody trunk on this. This was in a terracotta pot that was maybe 12 to 14 inches across. And I did distribute this to a few people, including you, Bart. And I know that Rancho grew this for a while and actually sold it, I think, at some of your plant sales. But the Botanic Garden lost the mother stock. And I think Rancho eventually lost the mother stock. And I gave some to a couple of other people, and over time they lost it. And so I don't think this is out there in the world anymore, which is too bad because this was such a cute little thing. But this is what happens, you know.
Yes, although, like I said, I think we may have located one in a garden, a private garden in Berkeley. Um, I should probably get in touch with them about now to see, because it should be coming into bloom shortly.
Yes, please. It's just such a cute little thing.
It is,
Yeah.
and yes, we did have it at Rancho and propagated it for a while. Particularly Dylan Hannon did that, um, and um, and it was subsequently either sold all of them and didn't keep enough, whatever, but it's not at Rancho.
Well, you know, talk about a great container plant or a rock garden plant. So yeah, if you can get if that plant is in Berkeley and you think it's this, or even if it's something else, you know, if we can't definitively say it's Emerald Canyon, something along these lines would be fun to have out there in the nursery trade. And then another one that never even made it into the nursery trade. I know Bart has seen this photo. This is a white variegated form of canyon sunflower. I'm not usually a fan of variegated foliage, but this is, you know, usually some type of a mutation. Um, and you rarely see this among native plants. This was a plant that was just growing in oak woodland on one of the hiking trails here in Santa Barbara. And I took cuttings off of this plant and they rooted and then they died. So just sharing, you know, one of the unsuccessful attempts to get an unusual plant out into the trade. I mean, Venegasia is a really cool plant all by itself, but I think that, you know, that variegated foliage would have been even more appealing to people who like variegated foliage and might have elevated the interest in this native sunflower. But that was all for naught. And yet another plant that I kicked myself for not taking cuttings of. This was far and away the most intensely red and floriferous individual of Kekiella cordifolia I have personally ever seen, and I have seen a lot of it. And this was on Santa Cruz Island last year. And I don't know why I didn't take cuttings of this. I was with the executive director of Theodore Payne Foundation on this trip, and he could have taken it back to the nursery and grown this, but we didn't do that. So I know exactly where this plant is and can probably go get cuttings some other time. You can see it here with giant coreopsis already going dormant, and that's another favorite silver-leafed plant in the background, Hazardia ditonsa. And then one that is fairly common in Southern California in chaparral and oak woodland that, as far as I know, you can once in a while maybe get seed from some specialty nurseries. And I don't know that I've ever seen this for sale in a container, but maybe it's out there once in a while. It's a fairly substantial plant in the sunflower family. It used to be called Parisia microcephala. Now it's Accordia, and Sacapalote is its common name. and I tried looking this up to find out what that name means, but I failed. I think this is a really beautiful, underappreciated native plant that blooms in the summer. The photograph on the left is with one of my hiking buddies from LA. And this was taken in late July. And then the photo, it's the same plant, only in a different year and a little bit earlier in the year, in June, in full bloom with these purplish pink flowers. Some individuals are a very washed out pink, so I think it's worth doing some selecting, such as this plant. And here you see it on the upper left in bloom, growing with California buckwheat, Eriogonum fasciculatum, which is, I think, a really nice combination. I don't know if this plant was intentionally cut back or not, but there you get to look at the young foliage, possibly resprouting, maybe after a fire. Very broad-leafed, thin, clasping leaf bases. So it's quite bright green in the late winter, early spring, and then the flowers in the summertime. And I think the seed heads, those little puffs of white, are also quite attractive before they disseminate. And that's an image that I took off of the web thing. So that might be my last. Yep, that's the last image.
Okay, and actually, I have some comments on that one.
Okay,
At Rancho, we did grow that and sell it
you did?
at our plant sales back then. I don't know if it still is.
Wow.
It's from plants that are out in the plant community section of that garden. Um, the plants at Rancho did not get anywhere near as tall as the plants in your images. I think the Rancho plants only got to about 3 or 4 feet max.
Well,
Um,
this
and they
one,
and they went to the ground every year.
yeah, I think this one would have been, well, they die back. I mean, this
Yeah,
plant does go pretty, almost completely dormant, um, and should be cut back at that point in time. This is a little bit deceiving, that image. It's not really taller than my friend Nancy. She's short for starters, but it's a little bit on a slope and it's growing up through other plants. You can see there's melasma behind there. And then there's toyon in the background. So it's part of, this mixed shrub border, if you will. But yeah, typically the plants down in the Santa Monica's are 3 to 4 feet tall and maybe wider, but the flower color is so variable that that's why I included this. I think there's room for some selection to get some, reliable color forms.
yeah. The ones at Rancho were very washed out pink,
Yeah,
almost white.
yeah,
Um, and again, strictly a herbaceous perennial.
yes, yeah,
Um, you needed to clear it off every year because it would go fully dormant to the
that's correct.
ground, no structure left at all, just sort of like a peony in that regard,
Right.
for people not familiar with this plant.
Which is why it's nice mixed with other things, although it might be a little hard in this case to get back in there and prune it, if it's growing up through the buckwheat, you may have to just selectively cut it back, for example. But it just suggests some possible ways to use it in a garden. And that the biggest appeal is, of course, that it blooms late.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah, in summer.
right.
And again, being a daisy family plant, lots and lots of pollinators and
Exactly.
insects visit this plant,
Right.
which is one of the reasons we grew it.
Yep. Okay,
The
well,
I have 3 questions from the chat.
I'm going to stop
Or
sharing, right? With
you can leave that up if you want,
That's fine.
or
No,
you
that's
can
fine.
stop sharing and it will just be you, which is
I'd rather have pictures.
okay. Um, let's see. One is actually a question relating to all of the solanums that you showed. Maintenance of them. I find that they're oftentimes not long lived, or the majority of them aren't. And I'm not really sure why it is that one particularly will take and the others won't. It's not a clonal thing, it's just an individual plant thing. And was wondering if you had any insights on that.
I wish I did. I mean, that's been my experience as well. That some plants seem to persist and others just poop out. I don't think that it's a long life plant in the wild. They do tend to be rhizomatous in my experience. And so sometimes when you think the plant has completely disappeared, because they do go, for the most part, pretty dormant in the summertime, then you'll get, shoots popping up fairly close to where you originally planted. And so they can persist, only not necessarily kind of like, milkweeds, will maybe disappear where you planted them and then they'll pop up a few feet away. And I think of Solanum xanthii doing the same thing. I need to ask Barbara if that's been her experience, because she's got one of the oldest plantings of Mountain Pride that I'm aware of. But I've had that same issue of them not persisting for more than a year or two, and others, kind of doing this random showing back up in a slightly different location. And I don't have an explanation for that.
Okay. One of the earlier things was, can you speak briefly about the difference between, for horticultural purposes, the difference between species and cultivars and the various pros and cons?
I'm guessing that question has to do with whether cultivars are as desirable from a habitat standpoint as the
Probably yes.
wild occurring species. And of course, the answer is that depends. The vast majority of our California native cultivars are either selections from the wild or selections that have popped up in a cultivated situation and not the result of a controlled breeding program. The exceptions would be heuchera, iris, and mimulus, the monkey flowers. And I'm sure I'm missing something, but those are the ones that are most commonly, we get cultivars that somebody like Dara or Lee Lenz at Rancho, or Bob now with irises from Attilaha Nursery, where they're cross-pollinating and then selecting. So the bulk of them are either from the wild or natural hybrids, selections of an individual species, and I think they provide just as much habitat value as the rest of the populations from whence they came. Cultivar is simply, an abbreviation of cultivated variety. And so that can come from any number of sources, which I just alluded to. They can be a selection from the wild, like this beautifully colored form of Accordia. If I were to go back to that location and take cuttings of that and give that to somebody to propagate, that's just a selection of a wild occurring species for a particular feature that I find very desirable. If I was to gather those seeds and grow out a crop of seeds and find that one of them had better form or better flower color and make the selection that way, it's still a selection from the wild, just once removed because it came from a batch of seed. I referred to a couple of plants from the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden that I selected that were volunteers, seedlings that popped up on their own, like that Salvia Pacific Blue, which was a hybrid of two wild occurring species whose range overlapped in the garden. Now, Salvia munzii and Salvia brandigii, correct me if I'm wrong, Bart, but I don't think those ranges overlap in the wild.
Oh, they do wildly in Baja.
Brandigii is on the mainland in Baja?
Oh yeah.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. I thought it was just on Santa Rosa Island.
No, it's actually a coastal bluff plant,
Well, that's good to
oftentimes
know.
on Indian middens.
I've not seen it in Baja, so that's good to know. That's new information for me. Anyway, so their ranges were, brought together in the Botanic Garden, and we got that hybrid form. But it was a natural hybrid. I didn't do that. The bees did that. And let's see, what's another example? Well, the Encilia californica paleo yellow, that was just a seedling that grew up among other californicas, and the flower color was different. So it was a selection of a wild occurring species, but in a cultivated setting. So there's all these different pathways that we can end up getting a cultivar, which is simply reflects a plant that somebody like me or Dara or Bart or any number of other individuals find to be particularly interesting and of value for cultivation purposes. That they have one or more characteristics that set them apart from everything else and are deemed to be worthy of propagating and sharing with the gardening world. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it's sometimes not just the visual aspect of the plant,
Right.
sometimes it's the durability of it in the garden.
Thank you.
That
And
it
that's where that canyon silver, the Eriophyllum canyon silver, besides the super lacy foliage, was how I felt from my experience that it was more durable and adaptable than the other plants that we had been cultivating at the garden.
And sometimes it's also ease of propagation of a clone that
Yes.
of a species that is otherwise very difficult. That's why, like the Tree of Life nursery form of Trichostoma lanatum is very easy to grow from cuttings. And so it is a dominant thing in the nursery trade, and or that clone, even though it's an unnamed clone, it's still a clone. And I've certainly recognized it in gardens. It's not as purpley fuzzy as many, but it's much more easy to propagate and for most people to grow. So that's another reason why plants are selected and that they're not always named, even though they are clones. It just depends on who's behind it and for what purpose. Um, there were also another question, and I think we've kind of just answered it about why the whys of selecting cultivars, and I think you just answered that
Well,
question.
and the other reason, and this is not insignificant, um, by naming something, when we name something, it heightens its presence or profile, and it suggests that there's something special um, about that particular plant. Bigger flowers, more ease of cultivation, what have you, all the things we've just enumerated. But it draws attention to that plant. There's something that sets it apart. And that is another reason why I think cultivars continue to be of interest to people in the nursery trade at botanic gardens, and because of the appeal by the very naming of something gives it some cachet. It suggests that there's some additional reason why this plant is worthy of your attention. Not always, sometimes, I mean, there have been some cultivars that have been introduced that are not good when it comes to performance in a garden, that they're very fussy and sometimes even more fussy than the wild occurring parent. But, it's hard to know. And that's, again, that harkens back to why we developed that plant introduction program at the Botanic Garden to try to favor plants that had performed very well in more than just our own botanic garden. And there is no, statewide network that is doing that, which is understandable because it's a very big state. And, as we all know who have, been planting these plants for many, many years, something that does well in the Bay Area may just be lousy in the garden in San Diego, and vice versa, because we've got so many different microclimates and climate zones in our state and soil types. So,
And another question about, can you talk about when to add summer supplemental water? Uh, do you suggest early morning, evening, overnight, on foggy days, on cloudy days? What do you recommend in general for most people?
watering in the morning is kind of the rule of thumb, in the coolest hours of the day, which, morning. And then if you happen to be using overhead, then at least the water would, not persist on the foliage overnight, which could get you into trouble with soil or fungi or pathogens on the foliage. But yeah, morning is the best time, I think, whether it's during the winter months or the summer months. And ideally, if you've got a plant that is adapted to your climate zone, hopefully you won't have to do much in the way of summer. If you're going after plants that don't need summer water once they're established in the garden, it would be best to do the supplemental irrigating during the winter months. Like for us down here right now, we have had virtually no rain. I know most of you are up in the Bay Area, you've gotten a ton of rain, in some cases too much, but I've recorded less than a half an inch so far here in Santa Barbara this season, and we have nothing in the forecast, which is bad. But this is when the plants need it. And so I'm watering now. I'm not going to wait until summer to try to play catch up, because this is when the plants need it.
Good point. Another question is, what, in your opinion, is sort of the direction of native plant cultivars, and especially with both San Marcos Growers and Tree of Life Nursery coming to an end at the end of 2025?
Not good. I mean, those are huge losses to our horticultural world. Tree of Life has introduced, some good cultivars over the years. I don't think they've done a ton, but they've certainly contributed to propagating plants from places like the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden and Rancho/California Botanic Garden. So that will be a big loss. Randy, most definitely has been very supportive of the Botanic Gardens introduction program. And so that's going to, go by the wayside. There are other nurseries I'm hoping will, ramp up their production of native plants to fill the void. So time will tell. And Botanic Gardens can continue to do that. Your Garden, SBBG, California Botanic Garden. There's nothing to prevent them from continuing to do that, especially if they're continuing to collect plants from the wild to add to their living collections, and, keeping an eye on things that might be particularly valuable from a gardening standpoint. So there's no reason why there shouldn't be, new cultivars introduced in the future, but time will tell.
Okay, and then just sort of a last comment here from the chat, that just is mentioning that genetic diversity, which is more, again, what conservation focused on, isn't necessarily the priority for cultivars. Do you want to just comment on sort of that matter?
Sure. That's correct. When you're propagating clones, you are not adding to genetic diversity. And in a garden, that may not be, one's priority. You certainly wouldn't be using these clonal cultivars for restoration projects. unless that's where these, some of this material came from, it would be okay to put it back, but you wouldn't want to rely solely on one type of clonal material if you're doing restoration. You want as much genetic diversity as possible. That said, I do think that we should be growing a lot of wild occurring species in our urban gardens as well. It's, I think, increasingly important for home gardeners, public landscapes, commercial sites to be part of the biodiversity solution, if you will, and to continue to be adding more native plants to the built environment and helping to restore severely broken corridors. We have so much real estate devoted to landscaping in our urban places that have the potential to greatly benefit biodiversity of both plants and wildlife. And that's the whole thrust of Doug Tallamy's Homegrown National Park program. The amount of real estate that we're talking about is equal to, many of our national parks combined. And so we have the power to make a huge difference with respect to supporting not only the plants, but the wildlife and the synergy between the two. And so in that case, you would be wanting to favor, wild occurring species, and then, a handful of cultivars thrown in there for their aesthetic, and also their, they do support pollinators as well as other creatures, birds that are eating the fruits, what have you, insects that are eating the leaves for part of their life cycle. There's a lot of reasons to be using both cultivars and wild occurring species.
Yeah, and I would just add to that sorry, I do have a cold today. That's why I'm sounding so off, although it's mostly gone. But that a lot of our native plant cultivars, particularly in Manzanita and Ceanothus, have been chosen for color and profusion of bloom. So if you think about pollinators, certainly adding a Ceanothus concha or Julia Phelps to your garden is going to provide a lot more pollen and nectar to the insects than, say, a seedling grown, just random plant of Ceanothus. So that's just one of the things to think about when you are doing a garden focused on pollinators, much like also that image of Kekiela that Carol showed of the profuse blooming one. You're going to have a lot more hummingbirds serviced by that plant than a typical one that just produces a third or a quarter of the flowers that one does. But for conservation purposes of the plants, you definitely want to have more than just the cultivars, especially if you have a larger garden. So
Yeah.
I think that's all of the questions in the and comments in the chat. If there's any I've missed, please retype them in, and we'll try to get them in. But otherwise, I do want to thank Carol very much for this fun talk going through her horticultural past. And also just to remind everyone that's local that our talk, in-person talk next week is Dana York talking about plants of the Pacific Crest Trail. And that'll be here at the Botanic Garden in the auditorium this coming Saturday at 10:30 in the morning. We do have one other Zoom talk ahead, and that is on February 1st, and that is Richard Hayden, who Carol was mentioning and was Carol's #1 at the LA Museum of Natural History's nature garden, is now in charge, the horticulturist in charge of the High Line in New York City, a very well known and highly regarded and incredibly innovative garden. And he'll be talking about horticultural lessons from that garden. And just as a note in my correspondence with him, he was also mentioning that a lot of the plants in the Highline Garden are actually native to New York City itself. And then additionally, I believe it's around half or more of the plants in that garden are native to New York State. So it will be natives in a different situation and also with just different ways of growing these plants. So it should be a very interesting and informative talk for those of you who are joining us from afar. And you'll be able to sign up for that shortly at the Friends website like you did for this one. But I don't see anything else appearing here. Oh, there is a question about when is the next plant sale at the garden here. We do have one going on today right now. We have first Saturday of the month sales and then our Wednesday sales. But otherwise, our next bigger plant sale will be the third Saturday in April, which is, oops, actually, I have that incorrect on this piece of paper. But so the third Saturday in April, and it will just be native perennials and subshrubs, no woody plants, because we do want people to plant those in the late fall and winter, not in spring, because they're much easier to get established during the rainy season. So, Carol, do you want to have anything else in closing?
I'm kind of brain dead by now.
Okay.
So I don't think so. I think, well, other than to just, acknowledge all the support that I got from the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden during my time there to pursue, this interest in native plants and to be seeking out what we thought would be, some of the better selections to have in our gardens. And then the opportunity to do that with the support of places like San Marcos Growers and Theodore Payne Foundation when I was at the museum. So it's been a real privilege to be able to do that. And I've always got my eyes open, so I'm paying attention.
Yep, as are we all.
Yeah.
I see there's one other question that I'll just do a quick answer for. It was, what's the name of the ecologist who told me that rock mulches preserve the site ecology at Rancho? It wasn't that rock mulches preserve the ecology, it was that organic mulches disturb the ecology. And that you could see that particularly out in the plant community section where there had been organic mulch layers added in the past. Those are where the nettles, the exotic nettles and the exotic mustards are a big problem. The areas that never were mulched, which were particularly some of the Southern California chaparral areas and desert areas, have a lot of the local site microflora very much intact, whereas any of the organic mulch places do not. So the Zeltneras came up, the moss and lichen ground cover was intact, and I assume it still is. But and that it was Bob Ornduff who pointed that out to me when he was at Rancho doing a periodic assessment of the horticultural practices at Rancho. And that's why we just started using rock mulches where we needed mulches and trying not to use as much organic mulch, which really did change the chemistry of the surface of the soil detrimentally for local native flora in Claremont.
Thanks for the in Claremont part.
Yes, we have to be specific for all these horticultural questions.
Yeah, well, and it also depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much, Carol. I'll look
welcome.
forward to another talk sometime next year, I hope. You'll have to find another topic. So happy New Year to you and to all of the participants here today.
Thanks for all the great questions. There were a lot of good questions.
Yes, thank you for typing in your questions and comments. And this talk will be available online within a week. So if you have friends that you want to recommend that they see it, they'll be able to get a link to the Botanic Gardens YouTube site. Go to where you signed up for this talk, and you'll see we will be adding a link to this presentation within the next week.
You know, I do have one thing that I want to announce. It just occurred to me because it's coming right up. Some of your audience might be interested in the January program for the Southern California Horticultural Society, which will be a Zoom presentation. So it's open to everyone. It'll be a talk by the co-editors of the recent publication, California Eden, which was published under the auspices of the California Garden and Landscape History Society. So Susan Chamberlain and Christine O'Hara are the co-editors. And it's a really wonderful book about the landscape history of California. And they'll be focusing on their presentation to a lot of the gardens that are part of Southern California, but I'm sure they'll touch on other areas as well as part of their presentation. And that is January 9th. So it's Thursday evening, 7 o'clock-ish. So you could go to the SoCal website and register if you're interested.
And it is socalhort.org, correct?
Probably.
Okay.
I don't have that memorized, but Southern California Horticultural Society.
And there's a note here in the chat saying that you have a talk on Majorca coming up?
No. Majorca? Okay. No, I have a talk coming up for the Mediterranean Garden Society. That's the Italian branch. And it's about the nature gardens.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's open to the public, so I don't know how that works.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Someone put a link into the chat. So if you want that, please get it soon because we'll be signing off. So again, thank you very much, Carol, and look forward to more conversations.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you.
And now, thank you all.